Hope you'll turn in your Bibles to the 16th Psalm, because that is the psalm of note this morning. The text will be on the screen, but while you're turning there, I'll reiterate. Can't really substitute the value of looking in your own hard copy Bible, getting acquainted with it, used to it. Not that there's anything wrong with using an app, because I use a Bible app very often, but in terms of studying, don't just rely on the screen, is what I'm trying to say. That's just for extra help, especially for those who are unable to look at their Bible at any given moment. But this is lesson 3 of our study of this winter quarter in the Psalms. Psalms part 1, that is. Started in the 2nd Psalm, moved on to the 7th Psalm. Now we're moving right along again to Psalm 16. It is I would say, although there's not a whole lot of competition yet, it's the most, what word should I use? The most infamous, maybe, of the Psalms we've studied so far. And you'll see why, if you haven't already seen why, as we look at some of these verses in the Psalm. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15:33, "Do not be deceived. Bad company ruins or corrupts good morals." You've probably heard that very many times in your life, in various circumstances, maybe from your parents a time or two, in addition to maybe a sermon or a Bible study. But there's a reason why that is so often quoted or referenced. It's because it's true. Truer than we may have wanted to accept or believe earlier in our lives, or maybe truer than we still want to believe. Bad company corrupts or ruins good morals. So in order to keep the Corinthians from making that mistake, Paul told them, "Wake up from your drunken stupor, as is right, and do not go on sinning. For some have no knowledge of God." There are some people who have no knowledge of God. And it's not necessarily the wisest decision for God's people to make themselves intimately connected with those people as a rule. It's not to say that we won't have to associate, because Paul, again, he told the Corinthians to stay away from, for instance, fornicators in the world. You'd have to leave the whole world. You can't leave the world until Elon Musk, successfully inhabits Mars or whatever. And then Mars will be just as corrupt as the earth. So at any rate, there's really no escaping, because at the end of the day, the world is the people of the world, and you can't get away from these kinds of people that he's talking about without leaving the world. But his point is that our relationships have an impact on our lives. Period. Maybe a positive impact, maybe a negative impact. And so we are advised, as they were, to choose our associates and our companions wisely. Proverbs 27:17 says, "Iron sharpens iron, and one man sharpens another." You could probably flip that around as well. One man can dull another, or can sharpen another, depending on who that man is, depending on who you choose to be your companion or compatriot or whatever you want to call it. If we surround ourselves with people who are seeking to serve God, there's a positive impact. And Paul knew how true that is and how important that is, and so he encouraged it. One psalm that we didn't look at, where you may have expected us to begin, was the first psalm. And the first psalm starts like this: "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in the law of Jehovah, and on his law he meditates day and night. So that's a similar sentiment there. A man is blessed, the man who doesn't walk in the counsel of the wicked. Now, what does that have to do with bad company ruining good morals? Well, the more we associate ourselves with those who have no knowledge of God or those who are of the world, the more likely we are to walk in their counsel. And their counsel is not necessarily going to be, and most likely isn't going to be, wise spiritually, spiritual, good, godly counsel. So, in other words, the influence of the wicked on the godly, or wickedness on the godly, cannot be overlooked or ignored. So in Psalm 16, another psalm that's attributed to David, the 13th, if you're interested, going in chronological order here, numerical order, this is the 13th that's explicitly attributed to David in the Psalms, 14 if you count Psalm 2, which the Christians in Acts 4 attributed to David. But anyway, strictly within the Psalms, it's the 13th that's attributed to David. He deals with contrasting God's people, saints, they're called. A saint is, well, in the New Testament context, saint is a synonym with Christian, or just one of God's people. So a saint is one of God's people in Old or New Testament. It's not a special Jew or Christian. It's just the Jews were saints. Faithful Jews were saints in the Old Testament. Faithful Christians are saints in the New Testament. So he's contrasting saints, God's people, with idolaters or those who serve some other god, any other gods, plural. And he's going to talk about the way he feels about them, but we have to understand that not only is what he says a good precedent for us, but it's also inspired of the Holy Spirit. God's approval, not the approval of the world, so on and so forth. We'll see as we go on. So here's how he starts. Unless anybody has any comments or questions so far on the very little that I've said by saying a lot. Okay, so he says this. Preserve me, O God, for in you I take refuge. I say to Jehovah, you are my Lord. I have no good apart from you. As for the saints in the land, they are the excellent ones, in whom is all my delight. So he starts similarly to last week's psalm, Psalm 7. It begins like it's going to be that same kind of psalm. I take refuge in Jehovah, be with me, help me, deliver me, save me. But he quickly moves on from that to a different topic, but he still just expresses that idea, his relationship with God. In God, preserve me because in you I take refuge. But he says, furthermore, I don't have anything good. Whether he means within himself, maybe, apart from God, or period. I don't have anything good. There's nothing good in my life, maybe, apart from you. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that God is the only good thing, such as my wife's no good, my kids are no good, my, whatever else, all the things I have is no good. But it would be more like attributing all those things to God. So he's the only reason I have the good things that I have, if that makes sense, if that distinction makes sense. It's not that every single thing in my life is bad but God, but instead, every single good thing that I have is because of God. And apart from God, I wouldn't have those good things, which is absolutely true. Every good and perfect gift comes from above, James said. But this is similar to what he said, as he opens up the psalm anyway. Something he said after he heard Goliath mouthing off, taunting. He said, 1 Samuel 17:26, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" So this was David's mindset, as a rule. God protects his people. He deserves to be not protected himself, but he deserves to be defended. His name deserves to be defended, and he's going to do it. Defying the armies of the living God, not going to stand in David's book on his watch. So another thing, though, is God's people don't have any reason to be afraid of God's enemies. Remember Goliath? Probably. He's pretty notorious, pretty big fella. Nobody else wanted to fight him, but David had a different mindset. He had the mindset that God is going to help me. I'm one of His people. He's going to help me. He's going to protect me, and therefore I take refuge in Him. That's what he said in verse 37 of that chapter. He will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. So David had very much faith and trust in God, and he expressed that very, very often, including here in the 16th Psalm. Then he says this, "As for the saints," or the ESV says saints in the land. Your version may say something different, like on the earth or something like that. Regardless of which one is more accurate, the idea is the same. I mean, just take out the prepositional phrase, and it's the same regardless. As for the saints. Maybe he's just talking about in Israel, which in an Old Testament context would pretty much be exclusively Israel, because Israel was the only nation under God's covenant in that temporary time period. But by extension, it would apply to the earth as well. So wherever God's people are, here's what he says about them: they're the excellent ones. Kind of could be taken as an insult in a way to other people, don't you think? Especially in today's society of being easily offended by almost anything. They are the excellent ones. There are only one group of excellent ones, and it's the saints, God's people, the Jews in this case, but by extension, again, all of God's people at any time. They are the excellent ones, but, okay, first of all, let's ask this. In what way are they the excellent ones, do you think? Anybody have anything besides excellent? Probably not, but... Glorious, okay. Majestic. They're the majestic ones? That's what it says? Interesting. Didn't see that coming. I think they're pretty similar, though. I mean, glory, the word glory was a pretty interesting study for me, because I always, it caught my attention because of times when it's used, such as the glory of the Lord, and sometimes it was even used as almost as though it was a physical thing. The glory of the Lord will shine, and I started looking into what exactly is the glory in those contexts, and it actually does seem to have something to do with shining, glowing, radiant. That's probably where majestic comes from. It's, what the things we associate with being majestic. But the concept of shining seems to be built into the word glory and the concept of glory, being glorified. And in this instance, I think that fits perfectly in. If you think about it from a figurative or spiritual perspective, God's people are like, what did Jesus tell them they ought to be? Or that they were, actually. He told them they were. The light of the world. See, there's that light. They're the light. What does the light do? Shines. If you're in a dark room and there's a whole row of light bulbs, you're going to be able to easily see the ones that are working. It's on. It's shining. And then this one may be shining. All the other ones may be hard or almost impossible to see. You think about that from the perspective of the whole world. There are all kinds of billions of people on the earth, but not all of them are lights from a biblical perspective. Some of them are self-serving. Some of them serve idols, which David's going to deal with here in the psalm. Some of them are godless altogether. They don't have that quality that David's talking about. But the saints do. But even more so than that, and by the way, that's from their character, their hearts, their good deeds, their compassion. Anything a Christian does that imitates Christ makes them the excellent ones, like David's talking about. Yeah, Dean, do you have something? Yeah. Yep, you see it right in the correct areas and ways. That's what makes them. They're set apart. They stand apart. They're outstanding in that way, the literal sense of that term. But here's what's maybe even more applicable, not in the sense that we share this with David, but that we should share it. He doesn't just say they're the excellent ones from an objective, matter-of-fact basis or standard. He says another thing about them is that all my delight, he says, is in them. All. I delight in them. All my delight. In whom is all my delight. Now this is something that maybe Christians struggle with. We see a historical pattern in the Old Testament of God's people struggling with this, because what do we so often read about some of the Israelites doing in the Old Testament time period? They go and they start flirting with the idolatrous people, the nations around. They start to develop a fancy or a delight in those people, right? And how'd that usually end up? Good or bad? Bad. I say usually, and I mean that in the most extreme sense. Not just usually, 100% of the time. Bad. But we see that pattern. David says, my delight is in the saints. How might that be translated into real life practically? In what way would it be seen that, let's just take David for instance. If we could transport ourselves back to David's time, what are some things we might see in his life that proved what he's claiming here, that all his delight is in the saints? Okay, he wants to be with them. There's one. That's probably the most direct, obvious one. He wants to be with them. Because we kind of talked about this when we talked about being a cheerful giver back in 2 Corinthians. What does a cheerful giver do? Or 1 Corinthians, maybe it was. Well, a cheerful giver is somebody who gets cheer from giving. So they give often because it makes them happy. So what about these people the people in whom we delight are the people we want to be with? And it is seen. This is one of those things that I talk sometimes about the message that we're sending by our actions. We're always transmitting messages, whether we realize it or not. The things that I do say things. I might not say it, but the things I do are like a flashing neon sign sending messages to the people around me. The people who I delight in is being transmitted in my everyday life. And this is why, because they're the people that I most primarily want to spend time with. They're the people that I choose. That's one reason why every one of you this morning, you're transmitting a message, whether you realize it or not. The message that you've transmitted this morning is that you wanted to be here. And every single person in this room appreciates that and very, very greatly. Now, that, of course, excludes those who would like to be here but couldn't. But we're strictly talking about those who do have a choice, because that's the only time that a choice is made. The message is sent. I said that's the most obvious one. I don't know if there is another, really, way that we might see that David's delight is in the saints, other than he wants to be with them. He spends time with them. He maybe thinks about them, cares about them, prays for them. They are, again, I just can't say it any better than he did. Are the saints those in whom we delight? Or do we prefer to spend time with the world? Yeah, Dean?
Well, too, I think that the blessings that he might have gave to it was involved in it. And we know that if you bless him, he will bless you. So I'm sure there were some blessings that they did receive, just along, he had delight in them. So I don't know what else you can say.
Yeah. Yep. It can't be overstated. We should delight. It's just like any relationship falters. When does a relationship start to falter? Any relationship, not just a romantic relationship, although it certainly applies to that. Any relationship. When does it start to go south? Whenever we no longer delight. Primarily, not in necessarily a hostile way, but if you stop spending time with a person like old friends, this is why, sadly, friends usually have a falling out most of the time after graduating from high school, because you were with them every day, whether you wanted to be or not, if they were your school friends anyway, all day, every day. Then you graduate, and in order to be together, you have to make yourselves be together. And unless they're your, very, very, very close best friends, or maybe have some other connection to you, it's not gonna happen usually. So slowly, it's not like all of a sudden, as soon as you graduate, it's like I don't like them anymore. But slowly, the relationship, the connection, friendship sort of dies down because you're not with them. You're not spending time with them and associating with them as much, and therefore your bond decreases. Well, it's the same thing with the church. The more time you spend with fellow Christians, the closer your bond will be. And the less time you spend with Christians, the less and less and less, weaker and weaker the bond will be. And I think it's safe to say that in normal circumstances, seeing somebody once a week is hardly going over the top, I guess, trying to maintain a relationship, unless there's reasons why that's the only time. And maybe you get together with somebody once a week for a meal or something, or like a lunch or dinner or something. That's one thing. But when Christians only see each other on Sunday, There will be side effects, unintended maybe side effects. David sets a very good example here that we should strive for. In the saints is all my delight. Dean? Yep. Okay. So the need for God's people to associate with God's people is found throughout Scripture. Romans 12:10, love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Competition is rarely a good thing. If you don't take it the wrong way, I'm very competitive, and it's not good in a lot of ways. But sometimes competition can be good. But usually, as a rule, competition brings out bad things in people. But here, Paul's almost encouraging it by that word outdo. Outdo each other. But not in who can, lead the best songs or who can say the best prayers or who can give the big contribution, but outdo one another in acts of service to each other. Try to outdo one another. Maybe we ought to try that sometime. No offense, but I think if somebody tried on their own right now to outdo each other in showing honor, I think they would win pretty easy. Because we're not trying that hard, really. Pretty easy game right now. But that's the atmosphere Paul encouraged. 1 Peter 2:17, honor everyone, love the brotherhood. So, association with God's people is not only, to David, is not only his duty, but he wants it. It's his delight. He actually wants it. And there's a big difference between, well, I associate with God's people because I have to, and I associate with God's people because I want to. You know the difference? Practically speaking, I associate with God's people because I have to are the ones who are going to be there the bare minimum. Because if you do something because you have to, you're going to do it only in so much as satisfies a checklist. Like, okay, I've done it enough to be able to say I've done it, and therefore I'm done now. That's it, not a step further. But those who do it because they want to do it, there is no limit. There is no limit. If anything, it's a minimum rather than a maximum. David didn't see associating with God's people just as a well, I better do it, but I want to. Period. And we ought to feel the same and do the same. Verse 4 then says, the sorrows of those who run after another god shall multiply. Their drink offerings of blood I will not pour out or take their names on my lips. Those who run after another god, or the footnote in my Bible says acquire another god instead of run after. People who go after other gods, any other god besides the one true God, is going to have a multiplication of sorrow. And David says, I won't have anything to do with their offerings, but even further than that, he says, I won't even let their names escape my lips. Not even going to speak of them, whether he means the people or their gods. It could go either way. But in other words, I don't think that's meant literally, but because he's talking about them right now. He's not mentioning their names, but he is talking about them. But he doesn't even want to say their names. That's how strongly he feels about the wickedness of idolatry and associating with idolaters because of the influence it has, which is everything we just talked about pretty much. Okay, now, the last section, which has the famous part. He says that, beginning in verse 5, Jehovah is my chosen portion and my cup. You hold my lot. The lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Indeed, I have a beautiful inheritance. I bless Jehovah who gives me counsel. In the night also my heart instructs me. Okay, we'll stop right there for just a second. He's saying similar to the way he started now. I take refuge in God. Now he says, He's my chosen portion. Just like he's already been talking about how the saints, God's people, are my chosen people, my chosen portion. Jehovah is ultimately His chosen portion. And His cup. It's His cup? What does that mean? Do you think it would be weird? Would it catch your attention if whoever has the next prayer within their prayer said, "Oh God, you're my cup"? I bet you would. That would, even if you weren't paying attention, that would catch your attention, and you'd be like, "What? What'd he say? You're my cup." Sounds kind of disrespectful. A cup? What do you think he means? Okay. Okay, let's take that use of the expression, for instance. When he says, my cup runs over, what's he talking about? What is his cup? Okay, blessings. So the blessings of his life, right? His cup are the, in that sense, he's kind of just talking about blessings. But in other places, a cup is a bad thing. Like, Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. The cup, in both instances, is something that is in your life at a given moment. This is my cup. Isn't that what he also told James and John and James and John's mom about you don't know the cup, you're not able to drink the cup, or maybe it was to Peter. But again, the cup is something that's in your life. Well, David here is saying, God is my cup. So the things in my life, or my life, period, is God. Jehovah is my cup. He is my life. I have poured Him into my life. Dean, do you have something?
Well, a cup we think is a container. It contains something, and it contains the blessings of God. And also we know that He pours, like I say, He pours it out on us.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just some of the blessings that we do receive. We have a cup, He has a cup.
Yep.
So it's something that, and it's symbolic, that we know that it's something that, can't really explain it.
Yeah, well, I mean, you did, though. I think we all have a cup. David says, God's my cup. He says, you hold my lot. What does that mean? What's your lot? We don't really use that word over here. I think they do in the UK more than we do here. The whole lot of you. They took the lot. It's all of it, is what it means. The whole thing. Whatever it is, the whole thing. They took, I think the only time we use a lot, other than a lot, we use that a lot. But, a plot of land, that you're going to build a house is a lot. But the lot is the whole kit and caboodle, the whole thing. God holds all of it, all of what I got. Yes.
And they drew lots.
Yes, that's another kind of lot. I actually am not sure how that ties in the word itself, but the way the casting of lots was more like.
How you were chosen.
Yeah, it's a very mysterious process, I think, because I don't think any scholar really understands exactly how they did it. But, they would cast lots. It's kind of like, almost like drawing straws. It's not like that, but as far as for our minds to understand, that kind of thing would be the way, the end result would be the same. This is the whoever gets the short straw or whatever is the one chosen. They would cast lots, and it's a similar kind of thing. I just don't think it's ever really explained anywhere in the Bible or outside the Bible exactly what they were doing. But yeah, that's another kind of lots that I wasn't even thinking of. So good observation there. Now, here he goes. I have set Jehovah always before me, because he is at my right hand. I shall not be shaken. Now, this may be starting to sound familiar, but if not, it's gonna. Therefore, my heart is glad, and my whole being rejoices. My flesh also dwells secure. Sound familiar yet? Well, it's about to. I hope. For you will not abandon or leave my soul to Sheol or Hades. I'll just read it like that. It'll sound more familiar. For you will not leave my soul unto Hades, or let your Holy One see corruption. You make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. Now that verse 10 should have really had the little bells ding-a-ling in your head, because this is quoted by Peter in Acts chapter 2. A very important chapter because it's the day one of the church. The establishment of the church, the kingdom of Christ, the kingdom of the Messiah, the Messianic kingdom, the church of Jesus Christ, the church of Christ, whatever you want to call it, the Lord's church. Acts 2 was the establishment of it, and this was the first sermon that was ever preached upon the establishment of the church. Peter quotes it, and he says, in fact, we just looked at this 2 weeks ago, I guess, in our sermon about Jesus being the hero of the whole Bible. And what did we say was the pattern in Peter's sermon in Acts 2 on Pentecost? What's the whole sermon about? Okay, let me ask it another way. Who's the whole sermon about? Jesus, the whole thing. Beginning in verse 22. First he starts and says, I'll tell you what's going on. The noise you heard and us speaking in these other languages that you can understand, speaking in your languages, I'll tell you what's going on. What Joel prophesied in Joel 2 is going on. But then after he gets done explaining that, in verse 22, he says, men of Israel, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth. And he goes on and on and on about Jesus. Well, get down to verse 25, he says, for David says concerning him, Jesus, I saw the Lord always before me, for he is at my right hand, that I may not be shaken. Therefore my heart was glad, and my tongue rejoiced. My flesh also would dwell in hope. For you will not abandon my soul to Hades, or let your Holy One see corruption. You have made known to me the paths of life. You will make me full of gladness with your presence. The wording's a little bit different, but it's very clear that this is what Peter is referring to is Psalm 16, verses, which verses exactly, where does it start? 8 through 11. Peter's quoting Psalm 16, 8 through 11. But he says it's about Jesus. Now here's the rule, okay? This is the rule not the rule, but a rule of Bible interpretation. Anytime a Holy Spirit inspired writer in the New Testament quotes an Old Testament passage, whether it's a prophecy or something that we wouldn't necessarily consider a prophecy, and tells us what it's talking about, then it is 100,000,000% exactly what it's talking about. There's no, we might could look at some statements in the Psalms and have a nice discussion, speculate, could this be talking about Jesus, But when Peter says that passage is talking about Jesus, it's talking about Jesus. There's no question. There's no room for any doubt or discussion. It is 100% about Jesus. But here's the thing. Did David know he was talking about Jesus? That's kind of the million-dollar question. Now, we could probably have a discussion about that. I'll tell you what I think. I don't think he had any clue that he was talking about Jesus. There are some instances when a prophet, or not even a prophet chosen by God, but like Balaam, when he tried to curse Israel, tried to get God to turn against Israel, so he was going to go up there and curse Israel, and God he literally in that instance put words in Balaam's mouth, and he came out with some of the most beautiful and glorious declarations about God and His people. I don't think Balaam had any idea what he was saying. Because God said, I'm going to, in a different sense than He told Moses or Jeremiah and other prophets, like, I'm going to put my word in your mouth. But He literally did that with Balaam. Balaam may be not the best example, but I think that it stands to reason that David was speaking from his heart. But he was also speaking in the Spirit, whether he realized it or not. But Peter says that passage is about Jesus. And he gives he reasons it. He doesn't just say it. He says, let me tell you why. Let me tell you why David could not have been talking about himself, at least in the literal sense. What did we say at the beginning of our study of the Psalms? What are Psalms? Songs. Or we might call them hymns, I guess kind of to distinguish from other kinds of songs. But like Paul said, psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. The Psalms fit in that category. Well, what do we normally associate with songs as far as their lyrical content? What is a song, kind of? And what's that? Okay, words. Poetry, yeah, they're poems. The Psalms fits into the section that's generally considered the poetry section of the Old Testament. Well, we sometimes use a little thing called poetic license. And what poetic license is whenever you're sort of allowed to, you're given a little bit of leeway to maybe stretch certain expressions or use certain words and expressions that everybody understands isn't meant to be taken as a literally right in your face on the surface sort of kind of thing, like where this is where a lot of the song police, if you've ever heard of the song police, who apparently believe that there's not a single song in any hymnal that we can sing scripturally. It's because in some instances they may be right, but in a lot of instances they don't take into consideration that poetic license. There are things that it can be expressed for the purposes of the hymn, the song, that's not meant to be taken, exactly to the letter, literally. Well, David was surely didn't actually believe that God wasn't going to let him die and stay dead. Anybody believe that he thought that? I don't. He obviously is saying this in more of a spiritual sense or a figurative sense. You're not going to abandon my soul to Hades or to Sheol. You won't leave me. But in Jesus' case, Peter says it literally was true. God literally didn't leave Jesus' soul or spirit in Hades, because you know what? After 3 days, his spirit or soul left Hades, went back into his body, at which point left the tomb. That's why Peter says this passage, David, he says, so he also affirms that David wrote the 16th Psalm, was talking about Jesus, the resurrection of the Christ. So Psalm 16 is a very important psalm for that reason, for that quote there in Acts chapter 2. which I spent too much time maybe on earlier things to say anything else about that. But I would encourage you to mark Psalm 16:10, especially, maybe 8 through 11, but especially 10. And just put Acts 2, 25 through 28, or Acts 2, 27 especially, but 25 through 28, or maybe just put Jesus. Just anything that just reminds you of the significance of that, what that's talking about.